Hello. Last month we started a look at the book of Daniel. We began an occasional series and we'll continue to dip in and out of it over the next few months. Now the previous sermons and videos are available online and we'll add them to the playlist as we go along. Today we're going to continue our journey and we're going to look at chapter 3. Here the story continues the court tales. These are stories about Daniel and his three friends living in exile and serving at the Babylonian court. Now, this story is quite well known, but let's read it together anyway. King Nebuchadnezzar ordered a golden statue to be built 30 meters high and 3 meters wide. He had it set up in the Jura Valley near the city of Babylon. And he commanded his governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, and his other officials to come from everywhere in his kingdom to the dedication of the statue. So all of them came and stood in front of it. Then an official stood up and announced, "People of every nation and race, now listen to the king's command. Trumpets, flutes, harps, and all other kinds of musical instruments will soon start playing. When you hear the music, you must bow down and worship the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Anyone who refuses will be thrown into a flaming furnace." As soon as the people heard the music, they bowed down and worshipped the gold statue that the king had set up. Now some Babylonians used this as a chance to accuse the Jews to King Nebuchadnezzar. They said, "Your Majesty, we hope you live forever. You commanded everyone to bow down and worship the gold statue and the music played. And you said that everyone who did not bow down and worship would be thrown into a flaming furnace. Sir, you have appointed 3 men to high positions in Babylon province, but they have disobeyed you. Those Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to worship your gods and the statue that you have set up." There's a little bit of historical context that helps us work out when this might have taken place. This probably took place in the first half of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This was the time when he was quite a powerful king and it was known as Nebuchadnezzar the Destroyer. And so it's probably around about 594 before the Common Era. Why do we think that? Well, you see, official Babylonian records show that there was a rebellion, there was a coup attempt. Part of the army mutinied. And if we understand this properly, it's even possible that Nebuchadnezzar had to defend himself in hand-to-hand combat in his own rooms against the leader of the coup. Following this, the king would probably want to do something to hopefully prevent a future rebellion. Well, erecting a statue and making it an imposing one and having an inauguration where all of the high-ranking officials are asked to pledge allegiance to the king, well, that will probably do the trick. Especially as we learned last time that statues of the king were often symbols of God's blessing the rulers. Remember our last video? The second piece of evidence that it might be around about this time is the fact that King Zedekiah of Jerusalem travels to Babylon. This is mentioned in Jeremiah 51. We know that because one of his party is given a message from Jeremiah to take these exiles in the far-off land. And so such a gathering of administrators and vassal kings is what's described in Daniel chapter 3. So the interesting probability is that the king of Judah might have been on the plain of Jura, yet we have no record of his objection. But back to the statue. And again, this reminds us that creating a statue or image of himself in gold, it shows us that Nebuchadnezzar understood that dream that he had in chapter 2. He desperately wants it not to be true. He wants to build his version. He wants to reject God's statue. He tries to replace it with his own image because he wants to keep his own power, his own dynasty, and his own country going forever. But this historical context helps us understand what this story is about. And it may not be what we've often heard. You see, we usually see this chapter as a story about true versus false religion. It's a reminder that true worship matters. And as Seventh-day Adventists, we usually go straight to Revelation 13 and the importance of the true Sabbath. But that's not really what's going on here. You see, this chapter is not so much a tale of true versus false. It's more about state or civic powers. State or civic powers that demand the allegiance that should rightfully only belong to the living God. So let's unpack that a little bit more. It's right that we weigh up, we assess, we discern true religion, true doctrine versus false religion and false belief. I mean, issues such as the nature and character of God, matters of salvation, these are vitally important. And of course, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I'm going to be concerned about God's true Sabbath. But Daniel, as an apocalyptic book, is concerned with pulling back the curtain, showing us what is really happening, describing that conflict between God and the devil. But the devil doesn't just work through religious powers and authorities. Daniel tells us that he can work through secular or civic powers and authorities. And just as we would assess true versus false religion, Daniel reminds us that we should weigh up the demands of the state. Well, how do we do that? Well, we hold them up to the values of God's kingdom. Values such as justice, equity, peace, stewardship. And we are to withhold our allegiance when the state goes against the values of the kingdom. In other words, our country does not get our uncritical support. Patriotism does not replace judgment. Caesar does not replace the kingdom of God. And if you're interested, the book of Revelation says a lot about the problem of civic religion. Only we often miss it because we forget to read it with first century Roman eyes. Now, of course, in the ancient world, civic power was often connected to religious power. And Revelation 13 tells us there will come a time when false religion and civic power unite. And Daniel himself will touch a little bit on that, and we'll cover it then. But here, the historical context, the rebellion, the summoning of leaders to pledge their allegiance, this context here tells us that the focus of chapter 3 is on the state, it's on Nebuchadnezzar, it's on Babylon as a country, asking for worship that the free Hebrew administrators just can't accept. So if it's not about the conflict between true and false religion, what is this story about? Well, quite simply, it's about how to behave when we're challenged. In other words, it's about how we resist and who is there with us. King Nebuchadnezzar was furious. So he sent for the three young men and said, "I hear that you refuse to worship my gods and the gold statue that I've set up. And I'm going to give you one more chance. If you bow down and worship the statue and you hear the music, everything will be all right. But if you don't, you will at once be thrown into a flaming furnace. No God can save you from me." The three men replied, "Your Majesty, we don't need to defend ourselves. The God we worship can save us from you and your flaming furnace, but even if he doesn't, we still won't worship your gods and the golden statue you've set up." Nebuchadnezzar's face twisted with anger at the three men. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Next, he commanded some of his strongest men to tie up the men and throw them into the flaming furnace. The king wanted it done at that very moment, so the soldiers tied up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and threw them into the flaming furnace with all their clothes still on, including their turbans. And the fire was so hot that the flames leaped out and killed the soldiers. So how do we resist? How do we stand up against evil? How do we stand up on the side of good? Well, in Israel, just before the time of Jesus, some stories or books were very popular. They were from a different time, but they had a connection to that world. You see, that was a world of occupation. They no longer lived in Babylon, but they lived under Roman rule. And many people found this offensive. You see, they were God's people and God had promised the land to them. God had made these promises. And so we find that stories of resistance become very popular. In particular, two books were really popular. The first book is set almost 400 years after Daniel. At this time, Israel is under occupation by the Seleucids. Now, this is one of the divisions of the Greek Empire after Alexander's death. The four generals split it up. We'll look at that later on in the book of Daniel. And in the king there in 175 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes, he takes the throne and he starts a war with Egypt. Now, wars cost money. So he takes the treasure from the temple to use to fund it, and he charges a tax and he kills many of the Jews that oppose him. He clamps down on Jewish practice and belief, and he even sacrificed the pig in the temple, and he builds a military fort in Jerusalem. So Matthias and his sons revolt against him. They lead a rebellion. It doesn't start off too well when 1,000 Jews are killed, that's men, women and children, because they won't fight on the Sabbath. Eventually, they realise they have to fight in order to win. So they become a successful and violent army. They even fight on the Sabbath, believing that resistance is more important than the commandments. And they eventually manage to capture a temple, they free it, they reconsecrate it, sacrifices start again. And that's the festival of Hanukkah. But you see why this story, the story of the Maccabean rebellion, was popular when they felt oppressed by the Romans. It gave them hope that a group of people with loyalty to their culture and their law could gain a victory. First Maccabees, that's the book, gave hope that they could be defeated. It told them they could resist. And people like the Zealots took up the challenge seriously and wanted to end the Roman occupation by violence. But there's another story of resistance that gained popularity at the same time. It's a story set not under occupation, but under exile. Do you know what the story is yet? Well, of course, it's Daniel. You see, Daniel introduces us to a group of people who are resisting. They're resisting not because of their love of culture or law. They are resisting because of loyalty to their God. And they resist not by violence, not by fighting, not by compromising their loyalty to God, but by non-violent resistance. When challenged by the king to show allegiance, they don't fight back, they don't organise rebellion. They simply stand up when everyone else bows down. They stand for truth, and they are willing to sacrifice everything for it. Daniel chapter 3 teaches us how to resist. It teaches us the importance of how we resist is as important as why we resist. You see, if we are loyal to our God, then our resistance must be faithful to his character. We're called to stand up when everyone else bows down. We're called to be loyal to our God. But we're called to resist in a way that reflects our God. Resist, but resist righteously. The Hebrew princes resisted, but they knew they weren't alone. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in the time of trouble. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers him. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego knew that God had saved his people at the Red Sea and had saved them many times since then. God is with you when you are loyal to him. But Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego also knew that although God is always with us, he does not always choose to deliver us in the way that we would like him to. God can work a miracle. He doesn't always choose to. In Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." And the answer was death on Calvary. God can deliver us, but he often chooses to have us witness for him in apparent defeat rather than obvious victory. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego didn't even try to argue with the king. They say to him, "Our God can save us." But even if he chooses not to, we are loyal to him. Unlike the Maccabeans, they will not compromise. They know that God will ultimately win. They know that his plan and his purpose will prevail. They trust God to vindicate them, if not now, then at the resurrection. Standing firm may come at a cost. Maybe not our lives, but perhaps our livelihoods, our reputation, our careers, our friends, our families, but trust the God who says he'll be with you. So resist, but resist righteously, and resist knowing that God is with you, even until the end of the world. Suddenly, the king jumped up and shouted, "Weren't only 3 men tied up and thrown into the fire?" "Yes, your majesty," the people answered. "But I see 4 men walking around in the fire," the king replied. "None of them is tied up or harmed, and the 4th one looks like a god." Nebuchadnezzar went closer to the flaming furnace and said to the 3 young men, "You servants of the Most High God, come out at once." They came out, and the king's officials and governors and advisors all crowded around them. The men were not burnt, their hair wasn't scorched, and their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise their God for sending an angel to rescue his servants. They trusted their God and refused to obey my commands. Yes, they chose to die rather than worship or serve any god except their own. And I won't allow people of any nation or race to say anything against their God. Anyone who does will be chopped up and their houses will be torn down, because no other God has such a power to save." After this happened, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego to even higher positions in the Babylonian province. This story is miraculous. I once worked in an office that caught fire, and after the fire we salvaged our files, and you could smell smoke on everything. Even years later you'd come across a patch of soot or a smoke-damaged file. So for these Hebrew men not to even have a trace of fire or smoke on their clothes or hair just speaks to the miraculous mystery of God's intervention. God is with them in the fire. They put their loyalty in God, and it was not misplaced. I can't promise you that the fires of life won't touch you, but I can promise you that God will be with you. He will be at your side. He will be next to you during your trial by fire. I can't promise you that you will escape the fires of life, but as long as you're in them, God will be with you, by your side, next to you. The presence of God in the fire doesn't just sustain these Hebrew princes, it testifies to the pagan king. It's so impossible, he reasons, it must be God. He started off this day expecting to have his leaders pledge allegiance to him. He ends it by pledging allegiance to the one true God. Our resistance can be a witness. Our behaviour during trials and adversity can be a witness. When someone looks at you surviving the trials of life, they know it isn't just you. They know that you've had help. When others see that God is with us, they will join us in loyalty to him. On one level, this story seems far removed from our lives. Kings, statutes, officials, state praise bands, fiery furnaces. But in another, it couldn't be more relevant. Because in this world, too many powers wish to claim our unquestioned allegiance. Country, community, nationality. Yet unfailing loyalty is not owed to them. It's not to be given uncritically. The only one we're to follow unswervingly is the living God. And in this world, saying no to those voices and standing firm for God can come at a cost. So we need to know how to say no. We need to know how to resist righteously. We need to know how to stand when all others bow. And we need to know, we need to trust, we need to experience and expect that our God is with us, even if necessary, to the very end. Is this an old fable? No. Is this a morality tale? No. Is this a fantasy story? No. This trial by fire speaks truth to each of us today. May you remain loyal to God. May you stand firm when all else bow down. May you resist righteously. And may you experience the presence of God with you in the trials of life. Amen.